Hello, my friends. This is Deepak again, and we are back on social media here, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, you name it. And we are continuing our series on science, spirituality, life, conversations with various authors. And today it's my great pleasure to welcome a very special guest. His name is John Horgan. You can see his book out there. Let's see. It's called Pay Attention, and it's about sex. What more can you ask? It's about sex and life and death and all the existential dilemmas that we have as human beings. John is a very prominent science writer. He writes for Scientific American. He writes for many other journals, magazines, and he's a prolific author as well. So, John, welcome, first of all, to our audience. We're going to be ultimately reaching 15 million people here. So I'm glad you have your book there. First of all, for my audience, which may not know you or know a little bit about you, can you tell us just a little bit about your career, and then let's get into the book.
Sure. I am a grizzled old science writer. I've been writing about science for almost 40 years now. I started out as what you might call a celebratory science journalist, writing about all the amazing things scientists are discovering. And gradually over the course of my career, I've become more of a critical science writer. And I still love science. I think it's our most powerful way of understanding the world and ourselves. But I think there are other ways of understanding ourselves and the world as well, including spirituality and mysticism. And I've written about that a lot as well.
So, John, a while ago, you wrote a book called The End of Science. And, you got kind of praised, but also criticized for it. Our common friend, Michael Shermer, was very upset with that book and with you as well. And he still teases me about it. He says, how can you talk to John? He thinks that there's no future for science. Do you really believe that, the end of science?
I do. I couldn't write a whole book if I wasn't serious about it. I think that science has discovered an enormous amount about the universe. It's discovered the basic laws that govern physical reality and the biological realm, and it's created this kind of map and timeline of the entire universe and of life on Earth. And we have these deep insights like natural selection and quantum mechanics and general relativity. The thesis of the end of science was that it's going to be very hard, given how far we've come already, to top what we've done before, to come up with something deeper than evolution by natural selection, quantum mechanics, general relativity. I still hold very much to that thesis, even though I think there's a lot that we can still learn about ourselves and about the universe. As I said, through some of these other modes of knowledge, like mysticism.
So I want to come back to that, but since you mentioned natural selection, I'm reading this right now, but I'm sure you've seen it, Evolution, the Changing Face of Our Greatest Theory of Nature. And it doesn't believe in natural selection anymore. They're talking about natural induction, something worth reading since you're a science writer.
There's always, one of the wonderful things about science is that it's in the nature of science to always be second guessing even some of the greatest hits of the past and some of the established theories. I think that's really, really healthy, but I don't see evolution by natural selection going away anytime soon or ever.
Well, you actually, this is a very interesting article because it talks about evolution horizontally, and it talks about the purpose of evolution is to actually gather knowledge. It talks about a lot about epigenetics and modulation. So, I think natural selection might be on its way out, as might be the whole idea that we live in a physical universe. But that's another conversation.
Let me just make an analogy. This is a really interesting point. And I've actually written about some of the challenges to natural selection and evolution recently. I wrote a piece for Scientific American on that. I make an analogy to the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory is this wonderful framework for understanding the evolution of the entire universe. We're constantly tweaking it and coming up with add-ons and patches. The Big Bang Theory leaves a lot of questions unanswered, as does natural selection. And I don't think that process of kind of massaging the theory will ever end. But the Big Bang Theory is as robust as ever. And so I would say is the theory of evolution.
I think both of them suffer from lots of problems. We don't have unification of gravity with quantum physics. We have the problem with that, what do you call it, that constant that Einstein talked about, the embarrassing, energy of the quantum vacuum. We have dark energy, we have dark matter. Only 1% of the universe is visible. That includes 2 trillion galaxies, 706 trillion stars, uncountable trillions of planets. Moreover, everything we know is a very species-specific experience through a human nervous system. And what guarantees us that that's the validity for truth? I mean, every other sentient species has its own reality. Why do we think that the human reality is the one that's right?
You know what? I know where you're coming from, and that you are raising these questions about materialism or physicalism, the idea that reality is matter and everything else is just a byproduct of matter, including our own consciousness. I'm in this 6 months project in which I'm attempting to learn quantum mechanics from the inside, the way the physicists understand it. I'm trying to learn it with the mathematics. As a result of that, I've begun to think of the foundation of science, which is physics. And physics comes down to quantum mechanics and relativity as being like a cloud. The foundation is, there's no substance to it. The physicists can't even tell us what matter and energy are, what a particle is, what time is. So, which is wonderful for a science writer. I sort of feel like, and this is somewhat of a contradiction to the end of science, that we're almost going backward into a state of greater confusion right now. And there are these profound questions being raised about the nature of reality and about the relationship of mind and matter that to me are wonderful. This is why I became a science writer in the first place.
That's great. I'm reminded of a poem from Roomie, the great Sufi poet. He says, exchange your cleverness for bewilderment. And he said, if you're not bewildered by now, go back to sleep.
Man, I am so bewildered. And I guess I've been sticking up for bewilderment, for recognizing that as much as we learn about the world, it remains fundamentally really weird, really strange. And that if we don't see it as weird, then we're not really seeing it.
I totally agree. I'm on board. I mean, if we take our existence for granted, we take our awareness for existence for granted, and yet we have no explanation for why we exist.
Yeah, it's right now is a period of science that it's as wide open as I've ever seen it. And in the sense that people are really raising these questions that are sort of embarrassing. If you're a hardcore materialist. In the 1990s, when I was still a staff writer at Scientific American, it was a period of triumphalism in science, where a lot of the leading scientists, Stephen Hawking, Steven Weinberg, Francis Crick, all of whom I interviewed for the End of Science, they were saying basically, science is explaining the world. It is dispelling all these mysteries that we have about the nature of matter, about the universe, where it came from, and about us, about consciousness. Over the last 20 years, that confidence and triumphalism has just been exploded, which is very upsetting if you're a hardcore materialist, who wants religion to go away and science to be triumphant. But I think it's exhilarating. Science has never been more exciting than it is right now.
Yeah, and every progress in science is invalidating a theory that was held to be sacred, you know.
Yes.
Anyway, now let's get to more interesting things like sex and why we should pay attention to your book. Tell me the evolution of this book, because it's fiction, and yet it addresses some very deep existential dilemmas.
Yeah, this book is a real departure for me. It's completely different than anything I've written, but I see it as a kind of culmination of things that I've written before. First, let me talk a little bit about the title, Pay Attention. So as you know, I'm deeply interested. I'm a child of the 60s. I've always been fascinated by mysticism and spirituality, the quest for enlightenment. The best description of enlightenment I've ever heard comes from this 16th century monk named Ikkyu. He said, enlightenment is basically just paying attention. Pay attention to your own life. And so I've always aspired to enlightenment. I've aspired to having a mystical outlook. And as a result of that, as a kind of spiritual exercise, I decided to write a book in which I tried to pay attention to everything that I did and thought over the course of a single day. And I did this originally about 8 years ago. I took detailed notes on all the things that I did in a typical day, commuting to New Jersey, teaching at my school, having lunch with a few of my professor colleagues, and then going to see my girlfriend that evening. Not only what I did, but I tried to record all my thoughts. So it's a stream of consciousness book. In a way, it's fiction. I changed the name of the narrator from John Horgan to Eamon Toole. And I changed the name of some other people in it to give me a little more creative freedom, but it's by far the most true to life thing that I have ever written. And it was wonderful to write. I really did see it as a kind of spiritual exercise, as a kind of exercise in mindfulness. And it stuck with me. Some of the things that I learned about myself and my relationship to other people were a little bit uncomfortable for me to learn. But it was by far the most fun of all my books to write, and the most illuminating because of what it helped me learn about the world and myself.
So as an author, we all want our thoughts and our ideas to be read by people so that we get some validation that we're not all by ourselves with these struggles. I want people to read this book, but what will they get out of reading this book? What will the common reader who's curious about existence, curious about their own existential dilemmas, curious about curiosity, curious about who, you said I was paying attention to my thoughts. Who was the I that was paying attention to the thoughts? Was it the thought by itself? Is thinking, doing the thinking about thinking? So those are my questions, but you tell us the subtitle, explain the subtitle.
Sure.
And tell us what the reader might expect.
Sex, Death, and Science is the subtitle. And that kind of sums up one of the things that I realized as I started writing this book. I'm a science writer. I've written for Scientific American on and off, going back to the mid 80s. So I'm I like to think of myself as a rational person, right? As an intellectual. I'm using logic and evidence to try to figure out how the world works and to try to figure out how I work and how I should behave. But my thoughts they're rational, sort of, but my rational thoughts about science, the thoughts that lead me to write certain scientific books, to reach conclusions about various theories, are all intertwined with emotions and feelings related to my status as a mortal creature. I'm going to die someday. I'm in my 60s now. I'm looking death in the face. I think about it all the time. I'm still, a mammal, a man, Homo sapiens. And so I also have sexual desire still. I still feel love toward my children, toward my girlfriend. All these thoughts are like entangled with each other. You can't separate out intellect and rationality from all these other thoughts. And one of the things I tried to do in the book is just to show how entangled all those thoughts are in a very ordinary day when I'm doing all these ordinary things. And I'm hoping that readers will relate. I mean, not everybody is a science writer. Not everybody cares about science the way I do and that you do and cares about philosophy. But I think everybody will relate to my own struggles to try to figure out the world and see things clearly when I'm constantly being buffeted by fear and desire, by all these emotions.
So, John, I come from a different tradition, from India, where these matters are very significant, and where life begins with sex as a fertilized ovum, ends always with death, and in between, there are all these issues that we have to deal with. So, once I asked one of my Indian gurus, I said, can you give me a good definition for life? He said, yes, it's a sexually transmitted, incurable condition which always ends in death. So your subtitle summarizes that. Having written this book, do you feel a little better about how you're handling these big issues of existence?
I do. I don't know if it's a matter of just getting older. I mean, it's a little weird that we're in a very dark time right now. But I feel, I know people who are really struggling. Some of my students have suffered terribly. I feel as calm and serene as I ever have, and I'm not sure if it's because I've been working to get there, or if it's just because I'm older and I've calmed down from what I was before. Maybe at this stage in my career, I don't feel like I have anything to prove. I wrote this book not as some part of some kind of grand career path, but because I can write it. I can write anything I want now. I don't really have to worry about making a big advance. This is a very experimental book. It was something that I really wanted to do, and I did it, and I found a publisher for it. So I will never reach the heights of enlightenment, but I feel like I'm able to stand back from the world and kind of watch it do its thing, and I get pleasure for that. I still care about the suffering, and I want to do something about that. I still write a lot about social issues in my Scientific American columns, but I'm more at ease in myself and more at peace with the world than I ever have been in my life.
I've watched you over the years. I've read your interviews over the years with great luminaries and great scientists, including all the names you mentioned and more. And, I've been a great admirer of your work and your openness to question scientific assumptions. Even science, everything starts with an assumption. So science starts with the assumption that there is physical matter. Now we have to explain it. And in the meanwhile, we kind of lose sight of the fact that we are psycho-emotional, physical entities. You can't separate your interest in empirical facts, which are a species-specific interpretation of experience. That's what scientific facts are, a species-specific interpretation of experience. But it's, as you said, entangled with emotions, feelings, fears, phobias, desires, insight, inspiration, love, compassion, joy, anger, resentment, the political scene, extinction of species. As you said, there's a lot going on right now. And if we don't ask ourselves these questions, then we are denying a very major aspect of our being.
I guess here is one way that I've evolved beyond the end of science, and I'm sort of moving further and further in this direction now. I see the quest for knowledge as absolutely infinite. And I think we're going to, and especially when it comes to the sorts of things that we're both interested in, what's at the bottom of reality? Is it matter? Is it mind? Is it something that transcends these categories? I think humans have always had this craving for certainty. We want to know. We want to know why we're here. We want to know what life is for. I understand that. I've always wanted that too. When I was a little kid, I was a Catholic, mainly because Catholicism provided the answers. I couldn't believe in that anymore. I turned to science. I turned to psychedelic mysticism. I'm comfortable now realizing that we'll never have the absolute answers. And I hope we don't, because I think that means that we are craving for certainty has won out over our clear vision of what is really out there, which transcends any belief system we can possibly imagine. What I'm hoping people will realize is that in exchange for certainty, we get freedom. We get freedom of belief, freedom to see ourselves in entirely new ways because of new discoveries and inventions of science, or even of philosophy and spirituality. And to me, that realization meshes with my view of humans as constantly reinventing ourselves. To be human means to be, even for a single person, you can't be captured by any system. You're always going to transcend that. And I think it's healthier for us to accept that there will be no endpoint to human evolution, no endpoint to this great creative process that we're in the middle of. Whoops. Good timing, right?
Good timing, and that spells the wisdom of uncertainty. Can you put it back on, please? I want our audience to see it. Yes. So, since you talked about uncertainty, and I'm totally sympathetic to that, the only thing that's certain is the past. I mean, right from this second onwards, there is uncertainty. The only thing we can, actually, I think certainty is a prison. It's the prison of the past. If we want to have an adventure, we should embrace the wisdom of unpredictability right this moment.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And that is, I'd say, a lesson that comes not only from quantum mechanics, but also from chaos theory. And I think just from a common sense view of life. I mean, my experience of life has been just when I really think I know what's going on and I think I'm on top of things, life throws something at me that I totally didn't expect. Often it's very disturbing and frightening. It's hard to deal with, but it's wonderful too. God forbid we should really have life figured out and we should really be able to predict the future. That would be a nightmare.
So, one of the things I've been doing now, you said you're in your 60s. I'm 74, by the way.
Good for you.
Yeah, I'm 74. And I also think about death a lot. So in my tradition, where I come from originally, I mean, I'm brought up in America now. So after medical school, I came to the United States. But in my tradition, the first 25 years, you educate yourself. The second 25 years, you seek fame and fortune. The third 25 years, you give back. And the fourth 25 years, which is where I am right now, you meditate on death and self-realization and enlightenment. So that's where I am, the fourth stage right now. So one of the things I do at night before I go to sleep as part of my meditation is I look back on my life, and I go back as far as I can to my earliest memories of me in my mother's lap. And actually, I can smell her skin. I can hear her voice. I can see her face. I can feel the love in my heart. And I can hear her singing. And then I ask myself, who is experiencing this? What is experiencing? Are atoms and molecules and neural networks and neural correlates and epigenetics giving me this experience, or am I making up the whole thing? And, I cannot convince myself that my self-reflection and my memories are the result of force fields, atoms, molecules, quarks, and gravity. I just can't, and I can't even answer the question, who am I? What is afraid of death? What is it? Is the brain afraid of death? Is DNA afraid of death? Is this body afraid of death? I have no answers, except I don't think it's something physical. I don't think it could be physical, because if it is, then we have a long way to go. I think this bewilderment is actually the key to finding some solace. In the Indian traditions, they say human suffering occurs because of 5 dilemmas. Once, we don't know the answer to the question, who am I? Number 2, you're grasping and clinging at experience, which is so transient and ephemeral that you can't even catch it. It's over before you experience it. Like these words are over before you hear them. It's gone. So
Yeah.
Number 3, we recoil from the same thing. Number 4, we identify ourselves with our personalities, our skin encapsulated egos. And number 5, you're afraid of death. And this is the human dilemma, without which we wouldn't even have art or science or philosophy or theology or anything we do as human beings. So that's why I'm totally fascinated that you put together in your subtitle, sex, death, because that's how we start and that's how we end. And in between, we're struggling.
Everything that you just said really resonated with me. My father just died in June, sort of toward the beginning. He was 96. He had an amazing life. So it wasn't, some deaths are tragic and premature. His was not. But as a result, I've been thinking a lot about the whole span of my life and thinking about my childhood. I have these memories of my father have come back to me, and of my mother, who died in 1989. And some of my earliest memories are really wonderful and warm and loving, but also I've always had these feelings of estrangement and somewhat of alienation from the world. I still have those now, but I've sort of spun them in a positive direction. I think that both mystical experiences, such as I've had, which mainly come from psychedelics, but also through meditation. I went on a retreat a couple of years ago that really affected me profoundly. These experiences make me see life as infinitely improbable, and just make you realize that there's no reason for us to be here, and yet here we are. And I think science is pointing in exactly the same direction. The physicists don't know where the universe came from. The physicists don't know why we have this universe instead of another universe that wouldn't have allowed us to exist. In spite of what Richard Dawkins says, we don't know why life began on Earth or why it went in the direction that it did, and why creatures like us emerged, these conscious creatures. So there's this mystery at the end of science that is pointing right to the mystery that's revealed in mystical experiences. For people who want certainty, they want an answer at the end of the road, they're going to be dissatisfied with it. But I look at it as, we won a lottery with infinite odds. I mean, there's just no way we should exist. Humanity as a whole, existence as a whole, but Deepak Chopra, there's no way you should exist. There's no way I should exist.
And yet, John Horgan, people like, what's his name, Sean Carroll at Caltech, say because it's infinitely improbable that we exist, there are infinite other universes and infinite versions of us that are equally improbable. So the whole thing gets utterly confusing.
They're grasping at straws. I
That's
understand. There's some scientists, and I admire, I respect some of these people. Steven Weinberg is an amazing person. He wants to show that this universe, our existence, was inevitable. And he wants to make that feeling of arbitrariness go away, because to the extent that there's no inevitability to our existence right now, we could vanish in an instant. That to me is the slightly scary takeaway from my view of science and even mysticism, but still, I think overall these are wonderful revelations to have. To realize, it just to me fills me with a sense of awe. And by the way, let me just say one more thing about this book. One of the problems that we have as humans, I think one of the obstacles to a mystical way of looking at the world, to the state of enlightenment, is our tendency toward habituation. We become accustomed to the world, accustomed to ourselves. We act like robots. We have things we have to do. We blindly move through life like we're sleepwalking. And I think natural selection designed us in that way because we become more efficient at getting stuff done and, fulfilling our biological purpose and all that kind of stuff. But what it means is that I think we have to put some effort into breaking out of those ruts, those habits of thought, and seeing the world in all its spectacular improbability. And that's what I was trying to do in this book, to break through the habituation, to pay attention to my own life and to every dumb little thing that I was doing over the course of a day. And I think that's something that's accessible to everyone.
So, my dear friends, the book is called Pay Attention, Sex, Death, and Science. I hadn't read a book where the author mentioned erections, the heebie-jeebies of extinction, and science all in one place. And so I highly recommend that you read this book and get even more bewildered, because as we say, bewilderment is the source of the human adventure that we call human civilization. It came from bewilderment and curiosity and wonder, and we cannot sacrifice them for anything dogmatic, whether it's dogmatic science, and we cannot surrender to the apostles of scientism who confuse the scientific method with basically a religion. Scientism has become the religion of Dawkins and all these guys, but that's okay. It actually helps the debate.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Any last words?
Pardon me?
Any last words?
Yeah. I agree. I think we're emerging out of a sort of dark period of arrogance among some of our leading truth seekers and scientists and philosophers, and I think it's wonderful. I think the realm of knowledge and philosophy is just anything can happen right now. Everything is on the table, and this to me is a wonderful thing.
Infinite possibilities.
Yes.
So thank you, John, for joining me, and we'll be sure to promote the book on social media, and I'm very honored that you gave me this opportunity to speak to you.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Deepak.
Okay, Carolyn.
Yes, I'm here.
So the